For us to avoid war, for us to find peace, for us to cooperate on sustainable development, we need shared values. We need global ethics, principles of how to develop our characters and how to guide our lives as individuals, as citizens, as nations, so that we find a way to cooperate fruitfully around the world and achieve the goals that we have set and build the future that we want. Now, ethics is the scientific study of how to achieve the good things in life. And it's an ancient area of study. When we examined the third age of globalization, the classic age, we talked about the axial age, identified by Karl Jaspers, in which the great thinkers between 800 BCE and 300 BCE emerged in different parts of the world. In ancient China with Confucius, in ancient India with Buddha, in ancient Persia with Zarathustra, in the ancient Near East with the Hebrew prophets, and in ancient Greece with the Greek philosophers, who all developed remarkable systems of ethics and principles to help guide behavior. Now, in the axial age, it is surmised that these remarkable achievements of Confucius and Buddha and Plato and Isaiah the prophet and Zarathustra and others emerged more or less independently, though there may have been some spread of ideas across Eurasia. But these are generally taken to be relatively independent developments of ethical systems that led to distinctive cultures and distinctive wisdom traditions in these different parts of the world. But now, in an interconnected world, we need to move to a global ethics. Of course, a global ethics that draws upon our great ethical traditions of cultures around the world. And we have the makings of such global ethics in sight. After all, in 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II and 3 years after the beginning of the United Nations, the new members of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a kind of global ethical document about what people all over the world have as their intrinsic rights because they are born free and in dignity as human beings. And the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, though not described as a set of ethics, is definitely underpinned by a shared perception and a shared understanding that a good life means one in which material prosperity is adequate, one in which there is social inclusion and social justice, one in which human beings are required and instructed and guided to take care of their physical environment, to live within the planetary boundaries, and one in which the norms and the guideposts of peace and cooperation predominate over the tendencies and strategic temptations of war. So the SDGs themselves can be considered, of course, to be filled with ethical insights, but not quite a global ethical system. I believe that in the coming years, we will develop more and more a common shared ethical understanding. And I like to refer to this actually as the ABCs, the basics, the ABCs of happiness and peace, because the ABCs for me include three of the greatest sages of human history: Aristotle among the ancient Greeks, Buddha and his teachings in South Asia, and Confucius, who preached a philosophy of harmony and mutual respect in ancient China. And for all of them, there is a commonality, even though these are very distinct traditions over a large and distinct area and civilizations. There are commonalities in the teachings of the ABCs of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. And the main commonality is that all of these great sages can be considered to be ethicists of virtue. Virtue in Greek, in ancient Greek, actually means excellence. So virtue by itself is a kind of excellence. But the virtue we think about when we use that term in English in the modern day is an excellence of character, knowing how to behave properly for our own good and to behave properly relative to our family, to our friends, to our fellow citizens, indeed of the world. And what Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius all taught was the importance of virtue in achieving the kind of good life in our societies, and the importance of cultivating virtues through education, through mentorship, through good example, so that we learn to be good people. Because for Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, they understood full well there are lots of temptations to cheating, temptations to violence, temptations to misbehavior, temptations to trying to take advantage of others. But what can make society work peacefully and cooperatively, what can enable us best to have good lives with our families, with our friends, with our communities, with our fellow citizens, and as citizens indeed of the world, is the excellences of our characters. For Aristotle, the primary virtues that he emphasized in his great work, the Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics, Nicomachus being his son, and this book presumably aimed at instructing his son in a good life. The excellences for Aristotle were temperance, which means moderation of desires, justice, respecting what each should receive, fortitude, meaning being ready to stand up for the truth, practical wisdom, meaning being able to judge what's good and right in a particular circumstances, because you can't always look at a list, what should I do? You have to make good practical judgments, which Aristotle called practical wisdom. Friendship as being central for our well-being, and citizenship. Because Aristotle said we as humans are naturally zoon politikon, that we are political animals. We live in a community. We can only thrive as part of a polis, city-state in ancient Greek, but now a political community. Well, Buddha had similar virtues that he preached, of course in a different context and in a different way, but Buddha preached first compassion, compassion for other people, and compassion for all forms of sentient life, of other animals that have sense experience and we should treat with respect. Buddha taught what became in Buddhist philosophy and wisdom the Noble Eightfold Path, meaning the right ways to behave in 8 different dimensions, the right view of things, the right kind of resolve, the right kind of speech, the right kind of conduct, the right kind of livelihood, the right kind of effort, and the right kind of concentration or mindfulness. So Buddha also taught excellence of character, virtue, compassion, and the right kinds of approaches in the right kinds of circumstances. Confucius was also a virtue ethicist, meaning that for Confucius, the excellence of character and building or cultivating that excellence was key, not only for our individual lives and our lives within families and the relations between teachers and students, but also between the ruled and the rulers. In other words, in the political context. And for Confucius, the excellences of virtue are benevolence to others, like Buddha's compassion or Aristotle's justice, righteousness, proper behavior, behaving properly with respect to friends and with respect to other citizens, propriety, meaning acting in the proper way, in the proper context, wisdom, which for Aristotle was also a virtue, knowing how to behave, fidelity or trustworthiness, which was a core virtue that Aristotle emphasized as key for friendship, and famously for Confucius, the golden rule, to not do to others what one would not want done to oneself, a principle that one finds enunciated by Jesus, enunciated by Jewish wisdom, enunciated by Confucius, indeed a feature of virtue ethics around the world. Well, I am of the view that this great body of wisdom, this ancient knowledge, has shared so many characteristics among each other. I think Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius would have had a wonderful time together, and they would have said, you know, we're on a common path. And that gives me hope also of a global ethics, because even though we come from different traditions, we have a shared human nature. And with that shared human nature, we can find a shared excellence of our behavior as individuals, as friends, as family members, as members of our organizations, whether it's businesses or schools, and as citizens, and find a common global ethic that can guide us. And what all of these virtue ethicists, these sages, taught us is that by being virtuous, not only do we have social order and avoid conflict, but we also find a path to happiness and well-being. And modern scientific studies of who's happy and who's not, and what are the factors that are conducive to happiness, find that these ancient sages teach us a lot about what we can find today about the paths to happiness. For example, happiness, according to scientific research, does depend on material well-being, but being super rich is not the key to happiness. Having enough to be able to have a decent life is the key to material well-being. Happiness depends on our head screwed on straight, that we have good mindfulness, good presence, good mental health. Happiness depends tremendously, not just on our own circumstances, how rich we are, but also on our friendships with others, on our ability to trust others, because we're happier in societies in which people are trustworthy, worthy of our trust, and in places where there are pro-social virtues like compassion and benevolence. Happiness depends on the quality of our governments. Our leaders should be honest. Our leaders should be trustworthy. Our leaders should live up to the norms of good virtue, because that makes our political systems work better. To have untrustworthy politicians, well, it seems to go with the territory, but it does not lead to happiness. And research shows that when people can trust their governments, they live happier lives. And finally, I want to emphasize time and again, happiness depends on peace. There is no greater source of suffering than the destruction and the losses and the deprivations of war. So virtue can help us not only in our own behavior, but to find the paths of peace, the trust, and the interactions across individuals and between leaders of different nations to find the path to peace. And peace is the path to happiness on the planet.